Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we're going to begin with Twitter saying that Trump is going to be off of Twitter and banned from it entirely, no matter what happens. Even if he runs again, even if he becomes president again, he will be off Twitter for the rest of time. Yeah, that doesn't sound so good. And it runs afoul, interestingly enough, of the Florida law that has been introduced, the bill that has been introduced. It's not law as of yet, as far as I understand. That is actually going to ban or severely limit and fine people who do this sort of thing. I do find that quite interesting that we're getting this sort of response now, but the more interesting part of this story that I want to talk about more in detail is actually how they're talking about Trump's ban. Because if you've been paying attention more deeply to their language than just what they say on the face of it, Twitter has been doing some very particular weasel words with how they've discussed why they banned Donald Trump. Because they never actually accuse him, even in this particular statement, of inciting violence. Rather, they try to claim, oh, we remove people who incite violence, without ever saying that Trump incited violence directly. And the reason they do this is because they don't want to get sued. Because they know for a fact that Trump didn't actually do that, and the impeachment managers and everyone knows that Trump did not incite violence. Everyone has seen the videos, everyone has seen the tweets, they've even put them up in the actual impeachment documents themselves, and in the impeachment material that was being seen in the trial. Everyone knows that he wasn't calling for violence, that he was actually explicitly calling for peace all the way through this, and part of the tweets that actually got Trump banned were calls for peace, not violence. Directly calls for peace, and condemnations of violence in tow. All of this sort of stuff is what was happening. And so it's funny to see people still continue to defend the claims of impeachment by saying it's emotional, and that all of these things were very, very much really sad. I saw the impeachment hearing, and it was, there was so much emotion going on. And I think it was funny because it was kind of exemplified in something that Ted Cruz said of it, actually quoting Macbeth. And I actually don't have the quote here, so I should probably get that. I forget what it was. I struggle at remembering Shakespeare. But it was something to the effect of fiery emotion, lots and lots of bloviating nonsense, but no substance. Essentially, nothing was actually said. And that is accurate. And it was funny for people to claim that wasn't from Macbeth. that was something that happened on Twitter, which was strange. Oh, man. That place is really accessible, and it really is just a leftist echo chamber. It is filled to the brim with them, and you can't escape them. And so that's really what's been happening. And this is an interesting admission from Twitter, because there has been sort of a separation, as of particularly recent, of the bannings of people who are private citizens and people who are public servants, people who are politicians and are political candidates and the like. And this sort of differentiation I don't agree with. And, I praised initially the Florida new bill that was targeting particularly those sorts of deplatformings, the ones that were targeting political campaigning and public officials. And I did praise that. But I remembered to couch it in that it was a first step. Some people have gone on from this to claim that it was just the sort of action that we need, and that it's everything that is necessary, and this is the end-all, be-all, and that sort of thing. And I am kind of baffled by this response, because it isn't the end-all, be-all. It doesn't protect someone like you. It doesn't protect someone like me. It doesn't even protect some of the larger political commentators that exist. It only protects people who are explicitly a part of some sort of political campaign, or actually are the political candidate, or the public servant themselves. And that kind of creates sort of a two-tiered system. Now, to be clear, I'm not actually criticizing the bill. I don't know how much Florida could actually do beyond this. The point I made at the time was that they could do this sort of bill because this was something that was directly affecting them, directly affecting their elections, and they explicitly made it clear that they weren't really going to worry about political candidates from other states. They were only really worried about political candidates that could be voted on in Florida. And that is good. That's about as much as I think they could do. And I just don't think that it's sort of the end-all be-all that needs to be done in this instance. I mean, I've always been a fan of the alt-tech thing. Just move on from these platforms. I don't see why you should be using Twitter, why you should be using Jack Dorsey's infrastructure, why you should be using Jeff Bezos' infrastructure. Why would we want to use those infrastructure anyway? They have shown clear contempt for conservatives, so I fail to see why trying to stay or taking the Will Chamberlain route of wanting to enshrine them as a monopoly for the rest of time is a good idea. I fail to see why that is useful or why that is even a popular idea. It's just, yeah, I don't like Will Chamberlain. Just in case you couldn't tell, I was really going to go off into the weeds there, because it really does infuriate me, this sort of thing. Because Twitter is a cesspit. And yeah, is it the most popular microblogging website? Yes. But here's the fact of the matter about microblogging websites. They're just a bunch of echo chambers. And the reason for this is that, compare it to something like YouTube. On Twitter, your most common way of browsing the platform, for the majority of people, is either going directly to specific people's accounts, A, or B, and that's what I generally do. I don't really like looking at my timeline. Or B, looking at your timeline. Yeah, you have hashtags and the sort of trending stuff you'll generally see, but I don't see a lot of people who use that as their day-to-day browsing on Twitter. Most of the time, you're only looking at at the people you're following. You're not looking at everyone. You're looking at, the sort of stuff that you were already looking at. And YouTube has a similar system, though I would argue it is substantially different in that YouTube has, on top of its subscription box as a way of browsing, it also has the recommendation page, the home page of YouTube. The home page of YouTube is the recommendation page. It isn't your subscription box. And I think that's actually an important distinction, because on YouTube, you're incentivized to actually find new creators all the time. You're almost disincentivized from looking through your sub box most of the time. Seeing as the sub box is always screwy. It's similar to Twitter's timeline. Twitter's timeline's screwy too. But YouTube's is screwy for, I think, a different reason. Because recommendations and the actual algorithm that's showing you things that you may like but aren't necessarily from people you always follow, that's really important. And I think it's important to having less of an echo chamber in your digital platform. Because as opposed to Twitter, where you are just following people you already follow, and by and large on the platform, you're only seeing content from people you follow specifically, and not a whole lot of other people, it means that, first of all, people can actually grow an audience on YouTube. Most of the time, when it comes to Twitter, unless it's some sort of gimmick Twitter account, people aren't growing an audience on Twitter. I mean, you see rare exceptions like the reply guys and that sort of stuff, but those people are truly rare on Twitter. Whereas on YouTube and other video sharing websites, you can grow a platform, you can grow a following purely through YouTube. You don't need to post your videos from YouTube to anywhere else in order to gain a platform, assuming that you're not getting algorithmically demoted. Maybe I shouldn't be using YouTube for this example. Maybe I should be using something like BitChute. For BitChute, you don't need to post your videos elsewhere in order to get traction or in order to grow an audience. You don't need to already have an audience to have an audience on BitChute. You can create an audience from nothing on BitChute. That's sort of what I'm doing here. It's sort of what every video creator is doing on either YouTube or BitChute or any sort of video hosting website. But Twitter is not that way. And the reason Twitter is not that way is because it is almost designed to create a bunch of different echo chambers that sometimes bounce into each other but never meaningfully interact. All right? Because everyone's timeline functionally acts as an echo chamber that shows only what they want to see. And that's kind of what Twitter is. And man, I really got off into the weeds in that one. So we're going to do a bit of a rapid fire for these next two stories because they're more filler stories where I don't have a whole lot to say or a big rant to do. or rather, just something I wanted to bring your attention to. And this first one is MI6, the United Kingdom's equivalent of the CIA, is recording foreign-born spies to increase diversity. Particularly, they are getting Chinese and Russian spies. Now, this is kind of amazing because it was recently revealed, like only a month ago, that the UK, and a lot of UK firms, and European and I think North American firms as well, were being infiltrated by Chinese nationals and members of the Chinese Communist Party. And these people were getting high-level positions in these companies and in these firms. So I think the idea of, after that scandal, hiring Chinese nationals to work in your spying agency is not exactly a good move. I don't know why I have to explain this, because I really, really don't want to have to explain this, honestly. Because it's stupid. I don't know why you would even imagine doing that. Well, actually, I do have... there is potentially a reasonable explanation for this, beyond just stupid progressive tactics like diversity and that sort of stuff. Because potentially, and I think the reason that they may have been going for specifically Chinese and Russian nationals was actually to get them to move to the UK side and then essentially become a double agent. I think that could be potentially their strategy, and everyone else who doesn't end up, essentially being loyal to the UK ends up getting shafted from having classified information, and that's possible. Potentially. Maybe. But do I really believe the UK government's that competent? No. No, I don't. So I'm just going to assume, at least for the time being, until I see evidence to the contrary, that they're just being stupid. That they're just hiring foreign-born nationals for diversity's sake, completely ignoring the security risks. Because that seems to be the more normal thing for government to do, honestly. But anyway, to move on to our next story. The demands have intensified for the razor wire fence around the Capitol to come down. And I am in full agreement with the people who are complaining about the razor wire fence. Because the razor wire fence around the Capitol, it makes them look like a dictatorship. And now, I am not a huge fan of judging things by purely iconography. I think I've made that clear in the past before even Breaking on the Daily was a thing. But in this case, it isn't about what it looks like, at least not in my mind. It's what the purpose of the razor wire fence is. Because what the fence is for is to protect the political leaders from the riffraff, which is the exact same purpose that such barriers exist for in foreign nations. In places like North Korea, in places like China. Once again, it's not about how it looks, because how it looks doesn't really matter. It's about why it exists. And why it exists is because a large percentage of the public reasonably believes that this election was sketchy. That the last election was sketchy, and that the government currently in place has no legitimacy. That is a substantial number of not just Republicans, but Democrats. There was polling that was happening early January, I think it was actually December, that was showing something like 30% of Democrats thought it was sketchy and weren't exactly sure of the efficacy of the election. And after that, the Time article, which I will continue to bring up until people start acknowledging it more than they are, has admitted to particular conspiratorial elements and has admitted to particular potential law breaking on the part of the people involved. And all of this in order to stop normal democratic processes. The only thing that they try to accuse Trump of doing is, one, preventing them from changing the laws, which is not illegitimate. Two, being popular and saying things that they don't like. And three, sending a bunch of poll watchers over to watch the polls and intimidate the poll counters. Yeah, sure. Because that totally justifies things like hiring a whole bunch of poll workers, a whole bunch of poll counters and also watchers to board up things with a poster board to prevent people from seeing things. That totally justifies kicking out poll watchers at any given opportunity because pandemic. It totally justifies all of that sort of stuff. Yeah. The answer is it doesn't. And it doesn't make their goal in that. And I think this is something that is undercovered even among people who are covering that story, was ostensibly to make the election credible and unquestionable. Well, they kind of succeeded in making it unquestionable online, on YouTube, where you cannot question the election lest you be banned. But they didn't succeed at making it credible. In fact, they did the exact opposite, through their direct actions, by the way. It was their direct actions that made the election look suspicious. And if it was all in good faith, let it be investigated. Because this isn't a case, and I think I've made this point in the past, where the election has any sort of privacy rights. It's not like the election is some person who is having their privacy rights being violated by being investigated. No. The election is supposed to be transparent as it can possibly be, without ruining sort of the voter protections that we have for voter anonymity. And even that I have grown to be less and less concerned with over time, because it seems to me that that the actual credibility of the election in its transparency is much more important than the actual vote being anonymous. I have found that to be the case, because who cares if your vote is anonymous, but if it doesn't mean anything at all because the counters are corrupt? Like, who cares? It wouldn't matter at that point. At least that's my opinion of it. But to move on to our last story, and one which has truly infuriated me in a lot of ways, mostly because it's hitting on a wound that has come up in my exploration of things like the sciences. And that is, the CDC has begun to recommend double masking. Now, people are going to defend this, despite the fact that Fauci said there's no such data to support double masking. There are people who are going to defend this, despite the fact that that quote was only about, a week ago. There are people who are still going to defend this. And one of their most absolutely, what's the word that I'm trying to grasp? One of their most broad defenses of these sorts of things. The same sort of thing they did for masks was science changes. Well, science does in fact change. Yes, over time, new sorts of evidence has come out, new ways of investigating things, new ways of measuring the world as we know it come into existence. All of these sorts of things happen. We do end up learning more about the world as we go on, and we continue to learn more even to this day. But science, decades of research, of population studies, of particular understandings of how masks affect populations in pandemics or epidemics, of particularly respiratory diseases, does not change in a couple of months or a week because of computer models, pseudo-scientific computer models, and unrepresentative lab studies that really don't show you anything other than the ineptitude of the people conducting it. That doesn't change the decades of research that contradict that. The newest evidence doesn't suddenly supersede every single thing that came before it because it's new. This sort of novelty bias that has perpetuated much of the scientific community and much of the public is something which has done nothing but destroy the credibility of science as an actual pursuit, and has limited its ability to actually to create understanding of the world. Because what it does is it makes an imperative to bring out the most politically advantageous and the most novel study possible in order to make it seem as though something is happening that isn't. I've had a lot to say over my entire YouTube career up to this point about models. And I imagine that I will continue to have this bugaboo, the reason being that this is a very pervasive thing. It happens all over the place, has happened for years, and people have just accepted this, particularly within political community, because they're not really interested in looking into the methodologies of these sorts of things, because frankly, they don't understand a lot of the methodologies of these sorts of things. And you don't need to understand every single thing they say in order to be able to understand when they're trying to pull a fast one on you. Because it can be telling from just how they word things and how they say particular things when you start getting past the abstracts that they're trying, once again, to pull a fast one on you. You'll see references to models, to statistical equations that make up new sets of numbers. You will find references to counterfactuals that do not exist. For instance, in the Germany study, that gets thrown around all the time. That Germany study is not showing that masks are effective because it uses as one of its base assumptions that masks work. Now, I hope you can see the problem of making such an assumption and then turning around and in your conclusion saying, we found that our assumption was correct in the model where we chose our assumptions and provided them to be correct through the model. Like, the model was always going to show exactly what the researchers wanted it to show, because the model itself is designed to show what it wants, what the researchers want it to show. It's designed to be easily manipulable, but hardly understood by the normal person. And it infuriates me, because this one in particular, the Germany study, was it was actually an equation. It was built on an equation. And that equation doesn't tell you anything about the natural world. It's some sort of inherent extension. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. You just put in your variables. You say, okay, here's the data that already exists. All right, here's our variables. Here's how we think it's going to affect things. And then the equation goes in, puts that all together with the original data, and spits it out with your assumptions intact. That's what it does. So saying that it found that masks help is simply laughable, because it didn't show that, because it didn't show anything except the scientists' own bias and their own assumptions that they made in the first place. Because fundamentally, that study was not a scientific study. They got to the part where they made the hypothesis and did the background research, and then they stopped. They didn't actually research anything. They didn't look into anything that was going on. They didn't do a statistical analysis that has any meaning. All they did was apply arbitrary variables that represent nothing but their own interests, own political interests, put it into an equation that jumbles up the numbers to make it look random, and then that's it. That's all they did. Is that a legitimate scientific pursuit? No. No, it's not. It's not science. It's pseudoscience. And you know, the word pseudoscience gets thrown around a lot. It certainly does. And in a lot of cases, that sort of pseudoscience that gets thrown around is somewhat accurate. You know, when you see people talking about psychic plants and the like. Yeah, that's pseudoscience. But the actual important part of pseudoscience, the parts of pseudoscience, the things which are pseudoscience that they actually want to cover, are not the things which immediately get discredited and that no one trusted in the first place and didn't come from reputable researchers generally at all. No. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the credible, largely trusted, and largely followed upon science from credible institutions, large institutions. That pseudoscience is much more insipid, because much of it is built upon what are fundamentally somewhat logical assertions and superstitions. Because that's what masks are, a superstition, not an actual solution to anything, because once put under the scientific method, as it had for the 100 years between 1919 and 2020, we had discovered that it didn't do anything for respiratory illnesses. But if you think about it from a purely logical, on its face side, masks seem like a good way to prevent disease spread. The reason being is that masks, depending on how they're used, can be used effectively to prevent things like smoke from getting into your mouth, or at least partially prevent that sort of thing from happening. Of course, what this ignores is that you're dealing with a wholly different size of particle in that instance. You're dealing with something that is actually visible, as opposed to the the particles coming out of your mouth that you can't even see. It's a wholly different scenario. But that's a superstition. And much of what these models are built on such superstition, such logical assumptions. But they aren't scientific, because they aren't based in any sort of study of the natural world. They are not scientific by definition. And that is the end of that story. Wherever you are, if you made it to the end of this video, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, go anywhere else. I'm not really interested in YouTube as a platform because I think it's dying and is fundamentally not useful for growing a political channel. On top of that, if you're anywhere that isn't Minds or Gab, hey, follow me there. I'm still on there, and if Parler ever gets back up, I'll still be there as well. And I think that's where I'm going to leave you today. I'm Kel Kidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.